Hello humans, it's just Martine, and today we're going to be talking all things January book reading wrap-up stats, fun times. It is the end of January. Now it's February, but you get the point. January's done, and that means that we have books that I read in January, and I get to tell you things about those books. This is mainly a nerdy stats video. I have a new spreadsheet this year that I'm using, and I also kept track of some new things for myself. So some of the usual things from all of the monthly recaps that I filmed last year, but also some new things. I'm really excited about it. We have some just numbers, some graphs. It's going to be really fun, so I'm going to jump straight into it, and we're going to talk about the amount that I read, I think is the first good category to talk about. So how many books did I read in January? It was 43. Is this concerning? Yes. One thing that's nice about this is that most of them were really short books. So it's a little concerning, but at the same time, it's like not too concerning, I'm telling myself. It was 4 Squash That series. Like, that's why I did it. So that's on that. And out of those 43 books, that landed me with a total of 12,940 pages, which is pretty good. Like, it's a good reading month for me. And that made the average pages per day 422. So if I was reading about 422 pages per day, how long was that taking me? Let's talk hours read in January. So the total number of hours read, sorry, I'm looking down at my computer, was 141.041. Nice. And that meant that my average per day was 4.5 hours of reading. I don't know what to say about that. Like, it's a little alarming. It is what it is. I don't know what to tell you. Another stat that I have this time is eyeball versus earball reads, as I like to call them. So how many days of the month did I spend reading with my eyes, and how many did I listen to audiobooks? So for eyeball reads, I read with my eyeballs 30 out of 31 days in January, which is 96.77% of the days in January. And I listened to audiobooks on 24 out of 31 days for a total of 77.42% of the month was audiobooks. For my 43 books, how long did it actually take me to finish these books? On average, it took me 5.837 days to finish a book. And that's on reading multiple books at once. Okay, now that we have those basic numbers over with, I'm going to shift to some fun graph time, and we're going to talk about some general book info. For instance, what genres was I reading? Here they are. So it looks like fantasy was my biggest slice of this pie, and that's mainly because I was reading series all month, and I found that a lot of series are fantasy series. Crazy how that works. I also read a good amount of contemporary, good amount of mystery, good amount of sci-fi, good amount of thriller, plenty of adventure because I had to read 6 Magic Treehouse books. But the top one was definitely fantasy because I read 10 fantasy books. In future months, I'll talk about the breakdown between fiction and nonfiction, but this month it's not interesting. I read a singular nonfiction book. 42 of them were fiction. So we'll just jump into book size. Some stats about this: my shortest book, page-wise, was Veronica Ruiz Breaks the Bank, which was 107 pages. My longest one was A Court of Silver Flames, which was 757 pages. This made my average page count per book 300.93. So even though I read a lot of short stuff, it kind of evened out in the end to be an average of a medium book. Basically, we can really see that influence of these small books. 55.8% of my reading were books under 300 pages. 37.2% of my reading was books between 300 and 500 pages. And then I read 2 books between 500 and 700 pages and 1 book over 700 pages. That was A Court of Silver Flames. This may change in future months, but unlike last year, I'm not aiming for a specific amount of medium to large books in this graph. As I said in my goals video, it's the year of short books. So we started off right with the year of short books. Plenty of short books here. My star ratings are maybe like the most depressing part of my reading in January, because as you can see, there's lots of 4 stars and lots of 3.5 stars, and that's great. But you know what's missing from this graph? Any 5-star reads. Not a single 5-star read in January. I got a 4.5 star read. That was good. But no 5-star read. I really avoided the extremes in January. Like, I didn't have any 1 or 1.5 star books, but I didn't have any 5 stars. So that's sad. And yeah, the majority of them were pretty good. 4 and 3.5 stars. I had 18 4-star reads. It's a good chunk. 14 3.5 star reads. You know, could be worse. It could be that I didn't even have a 4.5 star read, but I had that one. Could be that I mainly had 3-star or below reads, but I had a ton of 4 stars. So at first glance, it's a little sad I didn't have a 5-star read, but it could be worse. Oh, and all of this made my average rating for the month 3.5 stars. For series versus standalone, I was participating in Squashette series, so I read a singular standalone book. That was also my one nonfiction. So it was 97.7% books from series. And as a fun extra bonus statistic for Squashette series, I finished 7 series in the month of January. For author status, this is a new one. It's basically whether it's an author I've read before or a new author. I read 4 new to me authors and 39 authors I'd read from before. I typically will have a higher number of new to me authors, but because I was reading series, I was mainly reading from people I'd already read from before, because turns out they wrote the first few books in the series too. So the exception, these 4 books are the standalone that I read, and I did read a couple of first books in series, and that made up my new to me author category. For types of publishing, it's mainly traditional publishing. I have trouble, it's like really hard for me to tell when something is self-published versus indie published. So as much as the 2 different colors, the green and the blue, are there, I kind of lump them together. So between self-published and indie published, I read 4 books like that in the month of January, but the rest of them, 39 books for a total of 90.7%, were traditionally published. For publication date, most of them were backlist books. Again, that's pretty common when you're reading series. It's also common for my reading in general, but like when you're reading series, they had to come out before, you know, that's how that works. But I did read 8 books from 2023, which is good, and then 2 books from 2024. So I was really, you know, staying on top of it, I think. A lot of those 2023 reads, now that I think about it, were probably me finishing or catching up on series. For age range, the reason I had so many short books is because I read a ton of children's books. I, in fact, read 19 children's books, making it my largest category for 44.2%. My next largest category were adult books. I read 1 less adult book than I read children's books, so I read 18 adult books. And then I read 6 YA books, very chill on the YA front. Yeah, children's books, okay. I feel like there are 2 main sources of series in my life. Either they are largely fantasy or they are children's books. Often they are both fantasy and children's books. And I'm also more like tolerant, I would say, of fantasy books that are children's books, because I'm not like lost as often in those as when it's a big epic adult fantasy. So that kind of explains that. But I read lots of like Enola Holmes, I read lots of Magic Treehouse, I read like Smartest Kid in the Universe. I just read a ton of children's books, I would say. For format, this is interesting, but I read 72.1% ebooks. My audiobook chunk is pretty large because when I'm doing an intense competitive readathon, I always listen to more audiobooks than otherwise. So 23.3% of my reading was audiobooks for a total of 10 audiobooks, which is big for me. And then I read 2 physical books. That's it. That will hopefully change in February, but it is what it is. I really had to lean on my library to get these sequels in January. Speaking of the library, how did I acquire the books that I read? Mainly Libby. 86% of them I got from Libby. I would like to thank my libraries for helping me with this. I truly could not have done it without them. I also read 4 owned ebooks, so 9.3% of this, and then 4.7% are owned books. That's the 2 physical books I read. Hooray! But yeah, big shout out to my library. And actually, on the topic of the library, let's talk about money for the month. That's all my graphs. Let's talk money. First, we'll talk books that I acquired and how much I spent on books, and then we'll talk about the library. The only books that I'm tracking as acquired are books that were not free, so books that I paid for. If it was a gift or if I got it for free, I'm not putting it in my acquired tracker, because the main purpose for me of the acquired tracker is to see how much money I'm spending on books, not how many books I'm bringing in, really. So for books acquired, I bought 2 books in January, not shabby, and that's a total of $19.25 worth of book. I bought 1 book as like my souvenir book at a retreat I went to at the beginning of January. I bought that full price, and then I bought 1 book at the Dollar Tree. So $19.25 it is. Now let's talk about a ridiculous amount of money, and that's how much money my libraries saved me in January. 37 of the 43 books I read were from the library, and I put them all on my little spreadsheet and I looked up the retail price. I went full list price, not whatever it is on sale. I put the list price. I usually went for paperback unless the paperback is not out yet. Then I went for the hardcover price, because realistically, even if I did buy these books, I would go for the paperback if that was an option. So that's how I decided to count money-wise. The amount is staggering. In January, by using my library and reading library books, I saved $545.68. That is so much of the money that I made in January. And this is why I use my library. I told this anecdote in my goals video, but I did have somebody say to me early this year, how do you afford to read so many books in a year? And I said, because I don't pay for them. I use my library. This is a good example of what that means. That means over $500 worth of savings in 1 month. That's how I afford to read. Moving on from money, let's talk about my progress on goals so far. My Goodreads goal is 52 books. I read 43, so I'm at 82.59% of my Goodreads goal. Nice. I also had a goal to read 24 owned physical books. I read 2. That's 1/12 of my goal, which is 8.33%. And if you think about it, there are 12 months. Reading 2 a month, I'm technically on track. I also had the goal to read 24 owned ebooks. I read 4, which brings me to 16.66%, although I would note it does count, but all of these were in bind-ups that I have not yet finished. And so it is not a book on my Kindle app that is counted as fully read yet. So that's technically 0 for the year. But if we're being logical, books that I read, that I own in ebook form, I did read 4 of them. And then the last goal that I have some stats about here is about how I used my iPad for reading, because on my goals video I shared that I'm trying to earn myself a Kindle by seeing how much I can do my reading on the iPad instead of like on my phone, for instance, where I traditionally do a lot of my ebook reading. And so out of the 43 books that I read this month, I read 12 of them on my iPad, which is pretty good. 12 out of 43 books is 27.9% of my reading. So a little more than a quarter of my reading was done on my iPad. I think that's a pretty good amount. It was only 12 out of 31 of my ebooks, so 38.7% of my ebooks, meaning it was not even half of my ebooks. More than half of my ebooks were still read on my phone, and that I'm gonna need to work on. And February's already not off to a great start on that, but yeah. I think the main problem is I've been needing to read while on the go, and this is really hard to bring around and do that. Like, I can't stick it in my little bag, it doesn't fit. Whereas a tiny Kindle would fit. And so I think this does have some things stacked against it in that department, but a quarter of my reading being on the iPad is still really good progress. That means I read 19 ebooks on my phone. Wow, that's why my phone's always dying. It loses battery so fast because I'm always reading on it. Those were all of my January reading stats. If you liked this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below what was the most interesting stat to you, or is there anything you wish I tracked in January, and subscribe for more reading, writing, and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!